Dan, it's lovely to have you back on the Bulletin. Thanks very much for your time today. How do you think this ongoing crisis with oil, with energy, with manufacturing, everything that's been impacted, is going to affect the conflict in West Asia, and especially given the fact that we've heard talks about negotiations from both sides now?
It's impossible to say to what degree Trump would take this into account, but certainly there's political pressure on him. The coming midterms in the U.S. are certainly a drama. He doesn't want to go to that election. The Republicans don't want to go to that election in the middle of a huge inflationary spiral. You have to remember that the shortfall basically amounts to 10% of global demand. That may sound like something that can be resolved with belt tightening, but it's also concentrated in certain geographies. The fact that Asia is going to be so badly affected, and some countries may run out of energy within weeks, will mean supply chain disruptions, everything from plastic wrap to fertilizer all over the planet. That will cause prices to go up across the economy. That may cause wages to go up in a way that won't go back down if the strait is opened necessarily. So you're looking here at a shock to the system for sure. And to a certain extent, it may lead to permanent changes in behavior for partly because of the lack of trust that something like this couldn't happen. So Iran kind of opened up a Pandora's box in blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And for the Americans, the calculus has shifted. Remember that when the war started, the U.S. had a whole series of demands, which we've talked about on this show, and they seem to be demands that you could force on the Iranians, given a degree of the battering the Iranians took in the first day or two of the war, with so much of their leadership killed. There was a sense that surrender terms might be imposable. All of them, in my view, reasonable, that they should cease nuclear and missile production, that they should cease supporting proxy militias that have caused and continue to cause chaos all over the Middle East and the Arab world, maybe even democratic reforms. Instead of that, we're now hearing about a need to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and there are even reports that Trump might be willing to end the war without a full reopening of the strait, and simply declare victory. And you already hear this happening. Trump saying, well, we've done regime change because these are now different people. So the Iranians, despite being militarily thrashed and being, in my assessment, illegitimate in the eyes of most of their people, I'm talking about the Iranian regime, probably feel like in a way they're winning and they can outlast the patience of the world, given all this talk, including by us right now on the show, about the degree of economic dislocation, disruption, and destruction they're spreading across the globe. It is a dismal situation, and whether it causes the conflict to wind up quickly, in some people's eyes prematurely, is really an open question.
Dan, there's also been reports of Iran wanting to formally legislate this toll system that they've been experimenting with, an ad hoc toll system. They've put it now into their own law, but by international law, it doesn't really stand up. Do you think that the international shipping industry and the countries that rely on the Strait of Hormuz will put their confidence into this system that Iran may put in place and may start paying these tolls to pass through the Strait of Hormuz?
Great question. It's in the nature of blackmail that sometimes the side being blackmailed gives it, but blackmail it would be. And you're right to suggest that under international law, under any version of reasonable law, this is an outrage to a degree that is almost comical, because the Strait of Hormuz does not go through Iran. Iran has territorial waters on one side of it, the northern shore, but you can circumnavigate those territorial waters. What they're basically saying is, we'll fire missiles at ships or drones at ships outside our territorial waters, near Oman, near the UAE, unless you pay us a ransom. Will countries agree? I suppose in their desperation, temporarily, some countries might. But I cannot see how the international system accepts this as a legitimate path going forward. The Strait of Hormuz is in no way analogous to the Suez Canal, which goes through Egypt in its entirety. The geography is different. Iran does not have that reality, and absent that reality, does not have that right. The fact that they even bring this up and they go through the farcical motions of attempting to legislate some version of it shows you that they really do think somehow that they figured out how to turn their catastrophic military disadvantage into a strategic advantage by blackmailing anyone who wishes to do shipping through the strait.
Mm-hmm. We have seen some ships pass through paying up to $2 million has been reported to the Iranian government. Do you think that the industry and companies could look at this and say, well, this is a system, perhaps the ships will be protected, and they're desperate to sell this oil that they have waiting in those tankers? Do you think it could be half effective?
I think the blackmail might be paid temporarily by some shipping companies, and maybe even by some countries that are sufficiently desperate. Bangladesh, I don't know if they have the money, but they're going to be desperate very, very soon. The real problem for the global economy going forward is the degree to which this destroys trust. The countries of the Persian Gulf, on the other side across from Iran, have done a pretty good business by attracting Westerners mostly, but just generally becoming global business hubs on the assumption that they're not going to be bombarded by Iran. The fact that a fifth of global crude goes through the Strait of Hormuz from Persian Gulf countries, mostly not from Iran, that all depends on trust. Even if Iran ceases its misbehavior, absent a regime change in Iran, which now seems unlikely in the short term at least, the trust is gone. And with it, a lot of what offered stability to large swaths of the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
So today I want to reassure the British people that no matter how fierce this storm, we are well placed to weather it, and that we have a long-term plan to emerge from it a stronger and more secure nation.
Back to you, Dan. Now, before you mentioned trust, before the war, Trump was making comments about his European allies. Mark Carney recently at the Davos conference suggested a middle powers alliance. Is the US pushing away their allies with this war? Will we see a realignment in their alliances after this war?
The Donald Trump administration certainly is. It's a comedy of error almost, but maybe actually it's planned. Trump has been insulting his allies, demeaning them, calling them irrelevant, imposing tariffs on trade with them, seeming to prefer authoritarians, betraying Ukraine essentially to the shock of the Europeans. And just before the Carney speech, you mentioned threatening a NATO ally, Denmark, with invasion in his refusal to rule out force in the land grab in Greenland. I mean, it was really extreme. So the Europeans are very, very upset. As a consequence, now that Trump needs their help or would appreciate their help in the Middle East war, a war that he started without consulting with them, they peevishly get back at him by refusing, but doesn't seem so very mature because the Europeans need the Strait of Hormuz opened no less than the Americans do, and quite possibly more. The impact on Britain clearly would be significant if the global economy goes into recession or worse. Britain is a number 5 or 6 economy. So yeah, there's that. But mainly, for Starmer, the bigger issue is political and strategic. Britain, when it, in my view, blundered out of the European Union with the Brexit misadventure, it had hoped to establish really amazing bilateral relationships on the economy, on strategy, militarily, in particular with the US. Along comes Trump, who basically in an interview with the Telegraph in recent days just called Britain completely irrelevant. When asked, should Starmer invest more in his defense, said it doesn't even matter. So for Britain, there is, to say the least, awkwardness now, because the vast majority of Britons regret Brexit. Polls show that 60% or more would like to find a way to reverse it. No party's courageous enough to go there because it's just so complicated, and the price that the Europeans would place on it probably would be high. And all the various little exceptions that Britain had enjoyed before the Brexit vote probably would be gone. But for Starmer, we also see that he is talking about getting closer to Europe, and that's something that the Labour Party may need to render itself viable once more.
Dan, what's your take on this latest tweet, this latest post from Trump? He said that Iran's requesting a ceasefire. He said that the current president is less radical, more intelligent. Are you surprised by this statement from Trump, considering as Iran have denied being in negotiations with the United States for the last couple of weeks, acknowledging them a couple of days ago, but is it possible that Iran is actually asking for a ceasefire now?
Oh, anything is possible. Oftentimes, when the country is being battered very heavily, they might ask for a ceasefire, yes. But the trouble is that the Iranians are fanatical jihadists at the same time, and so they also might not. I tend to be skeptical about whatever is said in public in the middle of a war. It's posturing, it's signaling, it's messaging, but it isn't necessarily truth-telling to the public. So Trump says what he says, the Iranian regime says what it says. Neither party is particularly famous for telling the truth at the best of times. This is the worst of times. What I do, however, observe is that Trump is more than hinting that his ambitions are now scaled back to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Gone is the talk of a regime change. Gone is the surrender terms about the missiles and the nukes and the militias. And if the result is that Iran indeed ends its outrage in the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. ends the war and the Iranian regime is somehow emboldened and strengthened as a result of this, that would be pretty bad for the region, and it would be horrible for the long-suffering Iranian people. However, it need not necessarily be that way. If the war pauses in the same way that the 12-day war in June last year essentially paused, the regime may claim victory by the mere fact of its semi-survival as a regime, not as individuals who led it a month ago. But that may not be credible to all, and we might see a renewed explosion of protest. And this time, it might be possible to hope that the result will not be simply a massacre, but a weakening and maybe even a collapse of the regime. In other words, at this time the protest will be successful because basically perhaps the men with guns will now refuse to shoot into the crowds. So pausing the war might not necessarily be the catastrophe some foresee, and it appears as if Trump is willing to do that and to claim success, and even to claim that it's a regime change because it's no longer led by Khamenei the father, but rather, who knows, maybe Khamenei the son. His tweet is bizarre. He speaks of the current president, suggesting it's a new president. The president of Iran today is the same one who was president before the war, Masoud Pezeshkian. And he is indeed more moderate than the clerics. He's not a cleric. He's a doctor. He sort of operates in a Euclidean universe, and there is a reason to hope that perhaps if he really had power, then some plausible transition to moderate policies and maybe even a transition to a less brutal and dictatorial and oppressive regime in Iran might be possible. It's also conceivable that Trump is mistakenly referring to Khalibaf, who is the parliament speaker, who we believe to be the party dealing with the U.S., although they sort of implausibly deny it. We really don't know with Trump what he means, but it does appear as if he's looking for an exit ramp. And whether the war will then have been worth it, I think will be a judgment made by history and also dependent on what happens in the weeks and months to follow. As I say, it's conceivable that the regime has been weakened to the point where indeed it might fall.
Indeed. Dan, thank you so much again for coming on the show, and please stay safe over there in Israel.